The wind howled across the frozen valley, sharp and cruel like a blade. Snow fell in heavy waves, covering everything in white silence. Alira, a young alien mother, held her tiny child tightly against her chest. Her arms trembled, not from weakness, but from the cold that never stopped biting. They had once lived in a warm village, full of life and music. Her people had danced, told stories, and watched the stars together. But that was before the attack, before the sky turned red with fire and metal. The humans did not do it. No. It was another race-ruthless scavengers from beyond the Black Zone. Alira had run, carrying her child, through ice and storm, for days. They wandered with no food, no fire, no help. She found a broken shelter made of stone and snow, barely standing. It was not much, but it was the only thing between them and death. She wrapped her child, barely more than a newborn. In the last cloth she had, the child didn't cry anymore. His voice was too weak. She kissed his forehead, her tears freezing on her face. She whispered a song her mother once sang to her. Soft and shaking. "I'm sorry," she said to him. Her voice cracking. "I tried, my little star. I tried to save you." The cold crept into her bones. Deeper than ever before, she closed her eyes, her breath slow, her heart heavy. Alira was ready to die. If it meant her child would sleep peacefully in her arms. She hoped the snow would take them gently. Like a blanket from the stars, darkness came slowly. Like a quiet visitor, and then there was warmth. A strange warmth touched her face, her hands, her child. She heard a sound, low and human, a voice. She couldn't open her eyes, but she felt herself being lifted. Blankets wrapped around her, real blankets, warm and dry. The child whimpered softly. Someone held him close. Fire crackled nearby, not imagined but real. She wanted to speak, but her lips were frozen still. The last thing she heard before sleep took her again was a calm voice. "You're safe now," the voice said, deep and warm. And for the first time in many days, Alira didn't feel afraid. She slipped into darkness again, not from pain but from peace. Hours passed, maybe. Days before, she opened her eyes. The world was still cold outside, but inside it was bright and warm. A small fire burned in a makeshift fireplace made of stone and metal. Her child slept beside her, wrapped in soft human cloth, breathing easy, and there, sitting near the fire, was a human. He had dark hair, a kind face, and eyes full of concern. He noticed her wake and smiled gently. "It's okay," he said slowly. Clearly Alira blinked, unsure if she was dreaming. She tried to sit up, but her body ached. The human moved closer and handed her a cup. Steam rose from it, and she sniffed warm broth. She took a sip, weakly, the warmth spreading inside her like magic. Her fingers shook as she held the cup. The human sat beside her and pointed to himself. "Eli," he said, tapping his chest. She didn't reply, but nodded slowly. Then she pointed to her child, who stirred in his sleep. The man nodded with understanding and smiled again. "You're lucky," he said softly. "Another hour and you both would have been gone." Alira didn't understand every word, but she felt the meaning. This man had saved her life, and her babies too. She looked around, realizing they were inside a survival pod. It was broken, but still working enough to keep the fire going. Her heart was still guarded, unsure why a human would help her. They were not enemies, but they had never been allies either. Still, this one, Eli, had risked something for her and her child. Why? Alira watched him as he fixed the fire and checked the roof. He moved with care, not fear. He glanced at her often, making sure she was all right. There was no cruelty in his eyes, only concern. That night, as snow howled outside once again, Alira sat by the fire with her child in her lap. Eli handed her a blanket and nodded. No words were needed. She looked at him for a long time and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't understand, but he smiled anyway. And in that frozen world, hope sparked again. Alira woke slowly, warmth surrounding her like a memory. For a moment, she thought she had already passed into the stars, but then she felt the blanket heavy and soft, not snow or ice, and the air warm. Real warmth not imagined in a dream. She blinked against the light from a small fire. The walls around her were metal, scratched and rusted. It wasn't her people's design. This was human technology. Strange and advanced, yet full of life. Her child stirred beside her, still asleep, breathing gently. A soft sound, like humming, came from the far side of the shelter. There he was again, the human man, sitting cross-legged near a heater. He had taken off his jacket and placed it over them. His name, she remembered Defi. He looked up and smiled when he saw her awake. No fear in his eyes, no threat in his body, just calm, steady kindness. "You're up," he said with a nod, his voice warm like the fire. Alira didn't understand every word, but his tone was peaceful. He reached slowly for a container and poured warm liquid into a cup, then held it out to her with both hands. A respectful gesture, she hesitated but took it carefully. The warmth of the cup alone made her eyes water. She sipped slowly. It was like broth, salty and strange, but it gave her strength. Eli pointed to the child and gave a thumbs up. "He's strong," he said. "Fighter, like his mother." Alira lowered her eyes, not knowing how to respond. No one had ever called her strong before. She glanced at the fire again, dancing in the cold shadows. That fire had saved her life. This human had saved her life, and he asked for nothing in return. She studied him as he worked around the shelter. Eli moved with calm skill, checking machines, feeding the fire. His hands were rough but careful, his steps quiet but confident. He had been here for a while alone, yet surviving. Alira pointed to the heater and raised her eyebrows. Eli smiled and nodded, then used gestures to explain. He mimed something falling from the sky, a crash, then pointed to himself and the broken shelter. A shipwreck, she understood. This wasn't his home, it was his prison. He was stranded, just like her, two survivors from different worlds, now in the same storm. Ale looked at her again and pulled out a small packet. He tore it open and showed her dried food. He split it in two and handed her half without a word. Alira accepted it, grateful, though her pride hesitated. They ate in silence, broken only by the child's soft breaths. For the first time in days, Alira didn't feel helpless. She didn't feel safe yet, but she didn't feel doomed either. And that small change gave her strength later. Eli pointed to the entrance and made a snowstorm gesture with his hands. He showed a drawing mountains and a path marked in red. He tapped on it and then shook his head. "No go," he said. "Storm too big." They were stuck here, but they were not alone anymore. That night, the fire burned warmer than before. Alira fed her child and wrapped him close. She looked at Eli, now sleeping on the floor nearby. He had placed her and her baby near the fire. He had taken the cold side for himself. She felt something shift inside her, a soft feeling, unfamiliar and powerful. Not love, not yet, but something close to it, trust, a rare thing in her world. Now, slowly taking root, she reached out and pulled an extra blanket over him, then sat back, watching the flames. Snow whispered outside, like ghosts dancing in the wind. But inside, there was peace. Inside, there was light. And in that moment, Alira knew the fire may have been his, but the hope it gave now belonged to them both. Snow still covered the world outside, but inside the broken shelter, warmth lived. Alira sat beside the fire, holding her sleeping child close. The little one's chest rose and fell softly, no longer fighting for every breath beside her. The Humanila was slowly waking up. He had given her food, fire, safety, and even his coat. Alira didn't understand why, but she felt something she hadn't felt in days calm. She looked around the small shelter, half metal, half stone. It wasn't much, but here, they were alive. Eli stretched and smiled gently at her. His voice was quiet, careful, as if he didn't want to break the peace. "Morning," he said, tapping his wrists as if pointing to time. Alira tilted her head, not fully understanding, but nodded. Then he pointed to himself again, Eli, and smiled. Alira placed her hand over her chest. Alira, for the first time, they had truly exchanged names. Something about it, felt sacred to survivors. No longer strangers, he stood up and checked the heater. Then walked to a small crate near the wall. He opened it and pulled out a folded paper. It was a map, worn and half torn. But she saw symbols and paths drawn on it. He pointed to one area, a red circle, and pointed to himself and her rescue point. He said, then shook his head, drew a storm cloud and waved his hands to show danger. Too far, too cold, too risky for now. They were trapped for days, maybe, or even longer. But Alira didn't panic. Not this time. She had fire, she had food, and she had Eli. The man was a mystery, but a good one. One who protected instead of attacked. Later that day, he helped her feed the child. He didn't ask questions, just offered help when needed. Alira began teaching him a few words in her language. Simple. One's fire, child, food. Eli tried his best, repeating the words with a lopsided grin. His accent made them sound strange, but she didn't mind. They laughed together for the first time when he accidentally said snow instead of soup. Even the child giggled at that, a small sound that filled the shelter with life. Outside, the storm continued to roar. Inside, they created a world of small peace. Eli used old wires and panels to build a better lock on the door. Alira watched closely, learning how he used tools, how he solved problems in return. She showed him how to use her tribe's small herbal pouch. He sniffed. The leaves had nodded in approval as the smell cleared his nose. She crushed some into water, making a simple healing drink. They were trading knowledge slowly, carefully, but with respect. When night came, the shelter grew cold again. The fire was smaller now, the wood almost gone. Eli looked at her and gestured for them to move closer. No choice, he said. Cold is worse than pride. Alira hesitated. But the child shivered in her arms. She nodded. Together they wrapped themselves in the remaining blankets. Eli on one side, Alira on the other, with the baby safe in the middle. Their bodies created a shield against the frozen air at first. It was strange, so close to a human, but the warmth was real, and the comfort stronger than fear. She could feel his steady breathing, calm like the fire's rhythm. Her child slept deeply for the first time in many nights. Alira whispered something in her language, soft like a prayer Eli didn't understand. But he replied anyway. Safe, he said, gently tapping his chest. We're safe here, and somehow she believed him. As the storm screamed across the world outside, two survivors shared heat, silence, and the smallest spark of connection. Not lovers, not friends yet, but something was forming, something born from trust, not words. Alira closed her eyes, her hand resting on her child. Eli kept one eye open. Watching the door, always alert in that cold world, they were no longer just victims, they were protectors of each other. And of the little life between them, and though they did not say it out loud, they both knew the shelter was no longer just a place. It was a promise, a beginning. The third night inside the shelter was the quietest yet. The storm outside had slowed, but the cold still crept under every crack. The fire had burned low, flickering like a heartbeat in the dark. And in the middle of the shelter, 3 bodies lay wrapped together for warmth. Alira opened her eyes slowly. Blinking against the dim firelight, her child slept peacefully. Wrapped in both her arms in Eli's jacket, beside her, she could feel Eli's steady breath. Slow and calm, he had stayed awake half the night, listening to the wind, protecting them in silence. She turned slightly and looked at him. He was still asleep, one hand near his chest, the other resting near the fire. His face, even while sleeping, looked tired but strong. He was not like the humans she had imagined. In her people's stories, humans were dangerous, chaotic, too emotional, but Eli had shown none of that. He had not spoken loudly, had not demanded thanks. Instead, he gave warmth, food, and safety without asking for anything. As the fire cracked softly, Alira picked up a piece of dry cloth and added it gently to the flames. She didn't want it to go out, not just because of the cold, but because the fire had become something more. It was the only light in their small world. When Eli stirred awake, she was sitting upright, feeding her child from a small pouch of warm liquid. He blinked at her and gave a small smile. "Morning?" he said with a raspy voice. Alira nodded, returning a quiet smile of her own. She reached over and handed him a small piece of dried food. He accepted it, surprised, and chuckled softly. "Trading now, huh?" he said, taking a bite. It was a small thing, but it meant something. She was beginning to give back. They ate in silence, side by side, when they were done. Alira motioned toward the wall, pointing to the frost that had started to form again. Eli stood up and began reinforcing the door with metal sheets. She joined him, holding tools and helping where she could. Though they didn't share a language, they worked like a team. Each gesture, each nod, each glance became a message. They didn't need words to understand that survival depended on trust. And trust was something slowly forming between them. Later that afternoon, Eli drew another picture in the dirt near the fire, a ship flying across stars, with a circle marking a safe place. Then he drew another dark shapes, weapons, destruction. He looked up at her and pointed to the second picture. Then at her, Alira's face tightened. Memories flooding back, the attack, the screams, the fire that destroyed everything. Her voice was low when she spoke. They came from the east sky. No warning, only fire. Eli sat quietly, listening. Even if he didn't understand every word, she continued, slowly using both words and hand signs. "They took many, killed more. No one left but me and child." She paused, her hand gripping her leg tightly. He reached out, not to interrupt, but to offer comfort. He gently placed his hand over hers. Alira didn't pull away. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone while remembering loss after a while. He stood and pulled out a small first aid kit. He pointed to her arm, which still showed signs of frostbite. With gentle care, he cleaned the wound and wrapped it in warm cloth. His touch was careful, not rushed, not rough. Alira watched him with new eyes. This human was not only strong but soft where it mattered. And in this moment, her heart opened just a little more, not because of the fire, but because of who kept it burning. That night, as the storm returned in small waves, they shared their space closer than ever, not just for survival, but because something inside both of them had changed. There was comfort now, even without language. Eli showed her how to use one of the small devices from his pack. It gave light, stored heat, and made soft beeping sounds. Alira laughed when she pressed it and made it sing. Eli laughed too, the sound echoing in the tiny room like music. Later, as the child slept again, Eli pointed to him, then to her. "Strong," he said. "He'll survive this." Alira looked down at her baby, then at the fire. "He will," she whispered. "Because we did." Eli looked at her, and for a moment, no words were needed. She had opened her world to him, and he had protected it like his own. The fire between them was not just heat anymore. It was trust, real and deep, built in silence and survival. Outside, the night howled again, but inside, two strangers were no longer strangers. They were fire sharers, life givers, protectors, and maybe, just maybe, something even more. Morning came in a cold whisper. The fire had burned low again, but not out. Eli was already up, quietly checking the perimeter of the shelter. He moved with caution now, like something had shifted in the air. Alira sat up, holding her child close. She watched him through half-sleepy eyes. He wasn't smiling today, his expression sharp, focused. Something was wrong even before he spoke a word. Eli stepped back into the shelter, brushing snow from his shoulders. He walked straight to the door and motioned for Alira to come closer. She carefully placed the child into a nest of blankets and joined him, pointed down at the snow just outside. There, in the soft white surface, were footprints. Not his, not hers, and not the child's. Larger, heavier, three-toed. Deep in the frozen earth, Alira's breath caught in her throat. She shook her head slowly, disbelief in her eyes. No one should be out there, not in this storm, not this far from the crash zones. Eli drew a symbol on the floor using a burnt stick. A rough sketch of a tall alien figure with spiked arms and sharp eyes. Alira recognized it instantly. Scavengers. The ones who destroyed her home, looked at the footprints again, and her body tensed. They were close to close. Eli pulled out a scanner from his pack. The small device buzzed weakly, then went silent. "Low power," he muttered, smacking the side gently. No signals, no way to warn anyone. He moved fast, checking the locks, reinforcing the metal around. The doorway, Alira helped without needing to ask. Her hands shook, not from cold, but from fear waking up again. She had survived the first attack. She would not lose everything a second time. The child stirred. Sensing something was wrong, Eli walked over and whispered to him softly, rubbing his small hands. He gave the baby a small heat pack and wrapped him tighter. Alira watched him and felt that same flicker of emotion from before, something close to trust. Later, Eli stepped out carefully, walking in circles around the shelter. When he returned, his face looked darker. He rubbed his fingers together and drew more prints in the snow using gestures. "There's more than one," he said slowly. "At least 3 sets." Alira sat down slowly, pressing a hand over her chest. Her heartbeat was fast, but her eyes were calm now. She had run once. Yes, but she wouldn't run again. Not with her child here, not with Eli watching over them. They prepared quietly, as if even their voices might draw attention. Eli handed her a sharp tool, small, but better than nothing. He set up tripwires using string and cans from their supplies. Alira placed small symbols on the walls, ancient warning marks from her people. Night came faster than usual. Clouds covered the moon, and the snow began to fall again. Inside, they dimmed the fire, letting it glow low. Like an ember, their breaths were shallow, their movements slow, and then they heard it. A crunch, not from wind, not from animals. Footsteps, careful and slow, circling the shelter. Eli held up a hand, and Alira froze. She covered the baby's ears and held him close. Outside, metal clinked. One of the traps had been triggered. Eli stood, holding a makeshift weapon made from broken tech and wood. He moved to the door, listening for the next sound, then a bang, hard and sudden. Something slammed into the side of the shelter. Dust and snow fell from the ceiling, and the child began to cry softly. Alira held him tighter, whispering to him, begging him to stay quiet. Another noise, claws scraping metal. Then a voice, not human, not hers, rough, growling, a language filled with threat they were trying to break. Eni looked at her, eyes asking a question. "Do we fight, or do we hide?" Alira reached down and picked up the blade he gave her. She nodded once, strong and certain. This time, she would not freeze. They waited behind the door. Hearts racing, breaths slow, another slam, and the door creaked but held. The fire flickered behind them, casting shadows on the wall. The shelter was not just wood and steel anymore, it was a shield. Eli stepped forward slowly, blade ready. Alira stood at his side, her baby wrapped in a sling across her chest. 2 survivors, standing against the storm and the fear outside. Not just for themselves, but for each other. And as another shadow passed by the window, Alira whispered a single word in her language. "Come." She was not afraid now, because fire had become something more. It had become will. The shelter trembled under the weight of something heavy slamming against the outside wall. Snow fell from the ceiling, and the child whimpered quietly in Alira's arms. Eli stood near the door, weapon in hand, his eyes locked on the shadows shifting outside. The tripwires had snapped, the warning cans scattered like useless noise in the snow. Alira's hands gripped the blade tighter, the fire behind her burning, low and red. This was no longer a moment for fear, but for choice, stand or fall. She had run once. But this time, she stood beside the human who saved her life. She would not let him face this alone. A voice outside growled again, deeper now, closer. It spoke in a guttural language she knew. While the scavengers were not just hunting for supplies, they had smelled weakness, had heard the fire, had seen the footprints. They knew prey was inside, and they were ready to take it. The door cracked. Slightly metal bending from the outside pressure, Eli whispered, "On 3," and held up his fingers. Alira nodded. Shifting her child behind a stack of blankets for safety, 1 finger, 2, 3, the door burst open with a violent crunch. A tall, dark alien stepped inside, its skin armored like black glass. Its eyes glowed yellow in the firelight, and its claws dripped with melted snow. It hissed, sharp and cruel. Stepping toward the center of the room, Eli lunged first. Slamming a metal rod into the scavenger's chest, it staggered but didn't fall. Swiping back with a claw that ripped his jacket open, he cried out, tumbling backward as sparks flew from the impact. Alira screamed, rage bursting in her chest like fire through dry grass. She darted forward with the blade, striking the creature's side. It turned toward her, but she moved fast, slashing again. This time it screamed deep. Ugly sound and stumbled into the wall. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Her heart beat like thunder in her ears, and she drove the blade deeper. The creature dropped with a heavy thud, bleeding dark fluid onto the floor. Alira gasped for air, trembling. Her hands covered in cold alien blood. She looked over to see Eli slumped near the heater, holding his side. Blood leaked through his shirt. Dark red and slow. No. She whispered, rushing to him. His eyes were still open, barely. Pain carved into every line of his face. Not bad, he muttered. Trying to smile, I've had worse, but his breathing was sharp and broken. Alira grabbed the first aid kit, her hands moving faster than thought. She ripped open cloth, pressed it to the wound, and tried to stop the bleeding. You saved me, she whispered. Now I save you, he didn't reply, just nodded weakly. Outside, movement stirred again. The scavenger had not come alone. 2 more shadows circled the shelter. Alira stood slowly, her back to Eli, her blade in her hand again, but now something else filled her, a different fire. She placed her child behind the heater, shielding him with everything she could, then turned to face the door, her feet steady, her voice low. Come. She whispered again, this time not in fear, but in fury. The door slammed open once more. 2 more scavengers stepped in. Tall and hungry, they saw Eli wounded, the baby hidden, and Alira standing alone. But they didn't know her. Not really. Alira threw a burning log from the fire into the air. Smoke and sparks exploded, blinding the creatures for a second. She charged, slashing, spinning, dancing through heat and shadow, Eli even injured. Grabbed a pipe and swung from the ground, hitting one in the knee. It was chaos, fast and brutal. But they fought like one. 2 species, 2 stories. 1 reason to survive. When it was over, the shelter was quiet again. The 2nd and 3rd invaders lay broken. The fire still burned, now brighter. Alira dropped the blade, falling to her knees beside Eli. She reached for his face, gently wiping the sweat from his brow. You live, she said firmly. Not as a wish, but a command. Eli laughed weakly, his lips cracking. Yes, ma'am, he whispered. I'll try. Then he passed out in her arms. She held him, rocking slightly as the snow fell outside once more. The baby cried softly, sensing the pain in the air. But Alira wasn't afraid anymore, because they had fought, and they had won. She was not the same alien girl who had closed her eyes in the cold. Now she was a fighter, a mother, and something more, a protector. And the human who lit the fire was not just a stranger anymore. He was part of her survival, and maybe even part of her future. The fire was steady now, strong and bright. Not just a flame for warmth, but a flame of survival. It lit the shelter like a heartbeat, soft and alive. Alira sat beside Eli, his head resting on her shoulder, his wound wrapped tight and healing. 3 days had passed since the attack. They hadn't spoken much, not in words, but silence between them had grown deeper, stronger. Their eyes spoke more than language ever could. Eli was weak, but alive. She had kept him warm, fed him broth, cared for his wound with a fierce gentleness. The child often sat beside him, small fingers gripping his hand like a vine holding onto a tree. Alira noticed how Eli smiled every time the child laughed. One morning, Eli opened his eyes and whispered, "Still here?" Alira smiled, brushing snowflakes from his hair. "Still here?" she repeated softly. That moment felt like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Outside, the storm had slowed. The skies were clearing just enough for weak sunlight to reach the ice. Eli pointed to the rescue, beacon blinking slowly now. He tapped it and smiled. Signal sent, Alira understood. Someone somewhere might hear them now, but strangely, she didn't feel the same excitement she thought she would. Not fear, but a strange heaviness. Would he leave once help came? Would the man who saved her and her child disappear back into his world? She looked at him, and something in her chest ached quietly. The fire warmed her skin, but not that thought. That evening, they sat close, the child asleep between them. Eli broke the silence first, pointing to the stars outside through a broken panel in the ceiling. "Where do you go after this?" he asked gently. Alira shrugged, her voice quiet nowhere. He looked at her for a long time. "Then, at the baby, then maybe," he said, "we find somewhere, together." Alira blinked, unsure if she understood him right, but when he reached over and took her hand, she knew this was not just kindness anymore. This was a bond, born in flame, pain, and survival, something strong, something real, not fast, not forced, but honest. A day later, the beacon flashed green. A human ship responded to the signal they had just hours before pickup. Eli stood, weak but walking, with Alira supporting his side. She packed the few things they had, blankets, tools, the drawing Eli made of their journey. The baby giggled as snow fell gently from the sky, not sharp like before, but soft. They walked together, leaving the broken shelter behind. It had kept them alive, but now they had a new path. When the rescue ship landed, the human crew looked confused at first. A human and an alien woman, standing side by side. A child between them. Weapons had protected them, yes, but trust had saved them. And that trust could not be explained by reports or science. Eli gave a simple answer when asked what happened. "She saved me," he said, pointing at Alira. "And I just returned the favor." That was all he needed to say, inside the warm human ship. Alira sat beside Eli, the child sleeping in her arms again for once. She felt warmth that didn't come from fire. It came from something bigger. From being seen, from being chosen. The stars outside moved fast as they flew away from the icy world. But something in Alira felt still peaceful. She looked at Eli, and he looked at her. A small nod, a soft smile, and nothing more was needed. She once closed her eyes to die in the cold. Now she opened them to a future she never imagined. Not alone, not afraid, but with a man who had changed everything. Not just by lighting a fire, but by staying, by fighting, by believing. And in that moment, as stars shimmered in the window, she knew she would never be cold again.